You should now all have completed your work on plant responses, so which means we're now going to move on to the next part of this communication, homeostasis and energy topic by looking at hormonal communication, and we're going to start with the endocrine system. Let's have a quick look at the learning objectives. We start with the need for communication systems in multicellular organisms, and we'll have a look at why animals and plants need to respond to their environment, and then we're going to go on to the communication between cells in cell signalling, which is a bit of a revisit from stuff you would have done at the beginning of year 12. So why is communication essential? If organisms are going to be able to cope in their environment, they have to be able to detect when the conditions around them are changing, and then they need to respond to those changes. Communication systems make sure that the information gets passed on from one part of the organism to another. So you might have detected something with your eyes, and that information is processed by your brain and then is conveyed to the muscles in your legs that you need to walk towards it or walk away from it. So that communication system enables that to go on. Once you've detected it, you've obviously got to respond. And these responses increase your chances of survival. So from an evolutionary point of view, any organism which is able to detect when things around them are changing and then be able to modify their actions in response to that are going to live longer, and those capabilities will be passed on to their offspring. And here we can see a nice example of a desert lizard which is responding to the heat in the environment by alternating its feet when it's standing on the soil, on the very, very hot sand. So this is detecting it and then responding to it. Got another example here of how organisms quite often respond to their environment in forms of camouflage. In this example, we've got the Arctic hare, which in the summer, when all the snow has melted, is a brownish colour, but in the winter it develops a very white coat to help it blend in with its background. The other thing, of course, is if you can detect changes in your environment, you might then be able to avoid those conditions. So if the environment around you is getting too hot or too cold, you might then emigrate or move to some other area where things are actually getting better. Now, it's not just enough to respond to the environment outside, you also have to respond to what's going on inside, and you have to make sure, therefore, that the conditions inside your cells and inside all your body tissues are at their optimal conditions, because actually the chemical reactions that go on inside our body, or referred to as metabolism, will actually be affected by changes of temperature or pH or water levels and so on. So we've got to be able to recognise when things inside the body is changing, and this is because the external environment around organisms is changing all the time, and this will affect the internal environment. So the internal mechanisms have to compensate for these changes. So like we've got in this example here, which some of you might recognise from the film Aeroplane, this is somebody responding to feeling too hot, basically, and obviously sweating. But I think in this case it was to do with stress. Plants also have this ability to respond to their environment. Now we've got a nice example here of a tree that's been pushed over, and even though it's been pushed over, it's actually still continuing to grow because it's still got some roots attached to the ground, and the branches are still growing upwards towards the light, and also showing negatogeotrophism as well. So responding to our environment then, any change to the internal and external environment is called a stimulus. And we have receptors in most organisms which can actually detect those stimuli. And the example we've got here is we've got the stimulus is light, and within the human eye we've got some receptor cells which are able to detect the different wavelengths of light, which give us the ability to detect colour, and just the ability to detect any type of light, which gives us the ability to detect light in terms of black and white. Now receptors vary quite a lot. Some of them are cells, and that would be, for example, with the ones we've just mentioned in the retina. So we've got rods and cones, which are specialized cells which have additional modifications to that cell which allow it to be able to respond to different types of light or different intensities of light. So these photoreceptors are then also connected up to the nervous system, and then that transmits the information to the brain, and then the brain responds by doing something, walking in a different direction, moving towards the light, moving where you've got less light, depending upon what's going on, or just being able to make sense of the world around it. Now, also just to remind you that we've also got proteins on the cell surface membranes, and these proteins within our membrane have the ability to act as receptors for other molecules, such as hormones, for example. So if we look at the example here, the effectors are cells which are bringing about response to a stimulus, and these effectors tend to be one of two types. It can either be a muscle, and these effector cells will obviously cause the organism to move in some direction, move a leg, an arm, and that type of thing, or it could be, the effector could be a gland. So the message might be sent to something like the pancreas to start releasing insulin in response to the changing levels of glucose in the blood. So these receptors and effectors are going to work together to communicate this information from one part of an organism to another. And this makes sure that the different organs in the body are coordinated so that they all work towards a common goal. And a typical example of this would be, for example, if you are dehydrated, then the brain is detecting this low water level in the body. It tells you to change your behaviour and to have something to drink, so you feel thirsty, and it also reduces the amount of water that is removed from the blood in the kidneys, so that also helps you to retain some water. And also, let's not forget that plants need to coordinate their activities. As we saw in the last topic, they need to be able to work out what season they're in, and then that will allow them to respond to that environment by doing the right things of either producing flowers or producing seeds or becoming dormant and so on. Cell signaling is the mechanism by which the information is moved from the receptors to the effectors, and the cell signaling process involves a couple of different possibilities. And the first one, it could be that the cell signaling occurs between cells which are next to each other, so we say adjacent cells. So in this example, we've got a nerve cell, and it is right next to another nerve cell, and that connection between the two is known as a synapse. And they communicate by secreting chemicals across that synapse, and that then triggers off another response in the next nerve cell, and that nerve cell could be a motor neuron which tells the muscle to actually contract and do something. It could be that the information needs to travel much further, and actually the cells are not close to each other. So a good example in this would be the hormone which is released from the brain, ADH, which communicates to the kidneys that they need to control the amount of water that is being lost from the kidneys. In this case, we use a hormonal system, and the cells release the hormone, which travels around the blood and then acts as a signal to the cells much further away. So a hormonal system involves endocrine cells, as you can see in that diagram, and those are released into the blood and they travel around the body until they find their target. And then we have the cell surface receptors, which are able to pick up these signaling molecules such as hormones. And just to remind you then, those receptors quite often involve things like the glycoproteins, which I've circled here, and these glycoproteins are shaped in a complementary shape to the signaling molecules so that they have the ability to bind to them, and that then triggers a response inside the cell, and we will continue to talk about that as part of this topic. So to summarise this then, cell signalling can happen via two systems in the body. It could be by nervous pathways or hormonal system, and either way the receptors are passing that information on to the effectors. So let's have a quick look at a couple of typical exam questions at this point. The first one, why is it important that organisms respond to stimuli? That is a very common first question that you would see at the beginning of a topic, a question that might be about hormones. Second question, give one reason why communication systems are needed in multicellular organisms. Again, this is a very, very typical question. It's really asking why organisms bigger than one cell big have developed communication systems in the first place. And thirdly, what is cell signalling? So I'm just going to give you a minute just to have a think about that, and then I'm going to go and give you the answers on the next part of this presentation. Obviously you can pause this so that you can think about this before you answer them, but I'll leave you to decide that. So firstly, why is it important that organisms respond to stimuli? This is ultimately to increase their chances of survival. Now if this was one mark, that would probably be sufficient, but you could expand this answer to say that that's because the environment around them is changing, and therefore you need to be able to respond to those changes that are going on. Give one reasons why communication systems are needed in multicellular organisms. To make sure that the activities of different organs are coordinated to ensure that the organisms are working effectively. So multicellular organisms tend to be specialised in that some parts of the body are specialised to do one thing and other bits are specialised to do something else. So in order for everything to know what they've got to do, you do need to send messages from one area to the next. So being multicellular inevitably leads to areas of specialisation, and that then needs communication. And thirdly, what is cell signalling? The way in which cells communicate with each other, and that's really how one cell modifies the behaviour of other cells in another part of the body. So if we go back to our learning objectives, we now need to look at the endocrine communication by hormones. We've already looked at how cells signal to each other. So let's have a quick look at this next part. Hormonal communication involves the endocrine system. The endocrine system is using hormones which communicate that information from receptors to effectors. So glands are producing hormones which then travel around and cause responses. So in other words, hormones are used to send information about changes in the environment around the body to bring about a response. And we've got a pathway there showing the stimulus is picked up by the receptors, which causes the release of a hormone, which then travels around until it lands on its effector, which is its target, and then that causes a response. Earlier I mentioned that the other form of communication is neuronal communication. Now we're not going to be covering that in this topic or on these PowerPoints, but we will be doing neuronal communication in more detail in the next topic. But just at this point we'll just mention it, and the whole neuronal communication belongs to the nervous system, and the nervous system is detecting and responding to the internal and external environment. And at this time the messages are sent as electrical impulses which travel along neurons, and that allows the organism to respond. So in this case, if we look at the pathway, we've got the stimulus picked up by the receptors. So for example, something like the eye, which is a sensory neuron, is passed on to the sensory neuron, which is then transmitted through to the central nervous system, which then passes the information on to a motor neuron, and that could be something, for example, like the iris changing shape so that you can moderate the amount of light that comes in and out of the pupil, and then you get a response. We're just comparing these two with each other, and what you can see here is you can see a nice direct comparison that everything is basically the same. You've got your stimulus, your receptors, but the difference of course is the means by which that information is being passed on, either by the central nervous system or by hormones. We're focusing now on the endocrine system, and the endocrine system is made up of glands, and these glands are going to be producing a range of different hormones which have different effects in various areas of the body. So an endocrine gland is a group of cells which are specialised to secrete chemicals which are known as hormones, and they have to be directly secreted into the bloodstream in order to be called an endocrine gland. So we've got an example here in this picture. We can see that the pancreas, which is just located near to the stomach, is releasing insulin into the bloodstream. Now this picture is showing a range of different type of glands around the body. We've obviously got different ones according to whether you're male or female, but some of them are common obviously to both, but the majority are in fact common to both. And what we can see here is we've got the pituitary gland, which is in the brain, and that one produces several different hormones. And we've also got underneath there the thyroid gland, which is just located in your throat, producing thyroxine. Adrenal glands producing adrenaline. Testes producing testosterone. We've also got the pineal gland producing something called melatonin, which affects your ability to work out where you are in the day. Thymus producing thymosin. Pancreas producing insulin and the other hormone glucagon. And the ovary, which produces estrogen, progesterone, and there's a few others as well. Now, you've got in your worksheets a table with hormones, and what I want you to do is I want you to look up the range of different hormones that we've got there. Now, I've put some of them on there. This table has a lot more than are on this this particular part of the presentation. So, for example, we've got growth hormone, gonadotrophins, ACTH, ADH, CRF, and so on. Now what I want you to do is I want you to complete this table by finding out which endocrine tissue produces each of these different hormones, where the target cells are, and what the effects are upon the body. Now you can look this up in your textbook. Some of them are on this presentation in the previous part of this slide, and you can also find the information, of course, online and look it up, and you should be able to find all of them. So just work through all the ones you've got in your worksheet and complete those, please. Most of them, as I would say, we're going to come back to at different times. Quite a few of them you'll already know something about. It's a good point at this stage to just mention something called exocrine glands. And a lot of people do get confused by endocrine and exocrine, but the exocrine gland are ones that produce chemicals which are secreted into ducts, and these are then circulated in the body, so they could go into organs, or it could be that they go into other tissues, or it could go onto the surface of the body. We've got example here of some of the exocrine glands, like the salivary glands, which produce salivary amylase, and obviously saliva, which is then secreted into the mouth. We've got the stomach, which is an exocrine gland producing things like pepsin and gastric juice and so on. And there's a whole range, and a majority of them, of course, are actually linked to digestion. But we also have a few there in the liver, and the liver is also involved with digestion, but also with what happens to the things that we have taken into the body and how we sort them out. So just make sure that you're aware of the difference between those two definitions. In order to be able to understand what is going on when hormones circulate, we need to have a bit of information about the different type of hormones that there are. Now overall, what happens is that they act as chemical messengers, and they're carrying these messages from one part of the body to the other, and they do this through the blood. So something stimulates that endocrine gland to start producing the hormone, and that hormone is then secreted actively out of the cell, usually by exocytosis, into the bloodstream, and then it's carried around until it hits its target. And of course the target it's hitting is detected simply by the complementary shape of that hormone to the target cell. Now, there are two main types of hormones. The first one are the ones which are proteins or peptides, and a good example of that would be insulin. So insulin is a fairly small protein. It's made up of two chains of amino acids which are bonded to each other by disulfide bridges. This was the very first protein which was ever sequenced by Sanger, and so from that point of view it has quite a lot of fame, and he was able to go through a very lengthy and time-consuming procedure to work out exactly the order of the amino acids in this molecule. Now the other type of hormones that we have are steroids, and these belong to the sort of lipids groups of molecules, and an example of this would be progesterone. And you can see here that we've got this kind of structure very similar to cholesterol, in the sense that you've got these rings of carbon, and attached to these rings of carbon you've got these side groups. They nearly always have hydrogens attached to all of these the angles, but you also have other things like the methyl groups there, the CH3 that you can see attached to that. So these are water insoluble molecules, and that therefore belong to the group called lipids. So hormones are secreted when the endocrine glands are stimulated, and this could be because it's received an electrical impulse. So it could be that the nervous system is working with this to actually stimulate the gland, or it could be because we've got a change in the concentration of a substance. So for example, a change in something like glucose levels. Another hormone can also cause the stimulation of an endocrine cell. So for example, follicle stimulating hormone releases in the blood, and then it works upon the ovary to get the ovary to produce more hormones as well. So those are working together. Now the hormones work in a range of different ways, but firstly all of them are going to diffuse into the bloodstream and circulate around the body, and they are not, I think it's what you have to remember here is that they are moving around the body, but they're not going directly to where they're needed. They are just circulating in the body, and eventually, if there's enough of it in the system, some of it will land upon the target. So actually, it's kind of, in our imagination, we think that the brain is secreting a hormone and then it travels straight to the ovaries. The hormone travels everywhere. It travels through your hands, down your arms, down your legs, but at the same time it will also travel to the ovaries and actually cause the response there. Everywhere else it just travels and it doesn't hit a target, so it doesn't work on those areas at all. This is summarised in this diagram that you can see here. We've got an endocrine cell secreting a hormone, and that's circulating around, and we've got two types of cells. One of them is a target cell, which has a receptor with a complementary shape, and the other is not a target cell and it has no complementary shape receptors. Now most of the time the receptors are found on the cell surface membrane, but we also have others which are found inside the cytoplasm. And either way, these cells are called target cells, and the tissue which contains the target cells is called the target tissue. Let's have a look at this in terms of an example. So a real-life example of hormonal communication would be the control of blood glucose levels. And this is one we're going to be looking at. It's one of the presentations that I'm going to be doing. So it's a good one for us to use at this particular moment. So the hormone triggers a response in the target cells, the effectors. So the stimulus is a low blood glucose concentration. So the body has recognised that the blood glucose level has gone down, and this is done in the pancreas. The receptors are on the pancreas cells detecting this low blood glucose, and then the pancreas then releases a hormone called glucagon into the blood. The effector are the target cells in the liver, and they pick up the glucagon and start to convert glycogen into glucose. And the response will be that the glucose is released into the blood, so the glucose levels will start to go up. This sequence of events is summarised in this diagram. So we've got low blood glucose levels, and that's picked up by the pancreas, and the pancreas responds by releasing glucagon. And the glucagon circulates in the body, and eventually it hits the target in the liver, and that causes the liver to release the glucose from the glycogen. So glycogen stores are broken down, releasing glucose, and that increases the blood glucose level, so you get a higher blood glucose level. If we take this a little bit further, the higher blood glucose levels could become a little bit too high, and that will be detected by the pancreas, which then causes insulin to be released, and that insulin will then circulate in the blood. It will it will land on the receptors in the liver and in the muscles and a few other places, and this will then cause the liver to reduce the amount of glucose in the blood and store it as glycogen. Now we're going to be looking at this process in more detail in another presentation. In our understanding of how hormones work, we're going to start with steroids. Now steroids are not water soluble, they belong to the group of lipids, and therefore steroids are able to pass straight through the cell surface membrane. And we can see here our steroid hormone is able to pass quite easily through the phospholipid bilayer, which makes up the majority of the cell surface membrane. And once it gets inside the cytoplasm, it would maybe bind to a receptor in the cytoplasm, or might find a receptor inside the actual nucleus of the cell. They will then form a hormone receptor complex, very similar to what you get with enzymes and substances. And you can see here in the diagram, that's a hormone receptor complex that's being created. Once you've got the hormone receptor complex, it will act as what we call a transcription factor, and that really is a group of molecules which will cause the DNA to start to transcribe a gene so that you can then make a protein in response to that. So this is how a hormone is actually modifying the activity of a cell. So as the hormone is released, it gets inside a cell or activates the cell in some way that it actually switches on a piece of DNA, so that the DNA is now activated, the gene is activated, we're going to create some messenger RNA, and we're going to produce a protein in response to that, and that's going to cause a change inside that cell in some way. And it's a really important principle that you need to understand how molecules cause the change in another part of the body. So how do non-steroidal hormones work? Well, these are the hormones which are often proteins, and therefore they're hydrophilic, which means that they can dissolve in water, and that means they won't be able to pass straight through the cell surface membrane because they're not soluble in the phospholipids. So they will have to be, if they are to enter the cell, they would have to be carried through with a protein carrier. But quite often what they do is they operate with what we call the two messenger model. I'm going to outline that next. So we've got a diagram here which is summarizing the events. So the hormone is the first messenger. Now you can see it here, I've just highlighted it in red. So the first messenger is a hormone circulating in the system. It's been released from a gland and it's being carried around in the blood to the receptor, which is on the target cell. So this is the first part of the journey. The non-steroidal hormone will bind to the specific receptor on that target cell, and it will form that hormone receptor complex. Once it's done that, what happens next is that this receptor is now going to activate the enzyme which it's really close to. So you can see that there's an enzyme there closely associated with that receptor, and that enzyme is now being activated. Now the only way that it can really be activated is that it has its shape changed in some way. So we always have to think, how does this happen? The receptor protein has now changed shape slightly because the hormone has attached to it, and that change of shape in the receptor is having a knock-on effect on the change in the shape of the enzyme next to it. So the enzyme is now going to be activated, its active site is going to become active, and what's going to happen is this is going to cause the production of a molecule inside the cell, and that molecule in this case is called cyclic AMP. And this molecule, the creation of this molecule, is the second messenger. And this is going to signal to other parts of the cell to cause changes in that cell, so that the cell is now going to behave differently. So this is why we call this the second messenger system. An example of this can be seen here, which is how adrenaline works. So the second messenger is called this because it takes messages from receptors from other parts and then activates a second messenger which causes a series of events inside the cell, and that series of events is called a cascade. And we can see, if we look carefully, you can see the range of events, very similar to what we described in the first example. So we're nearly at the end, and we're just having a look at the comparison between hormonal versus neuronal communication. So hormonal systems communicate using chemicals called hormones. The nervous system uses nerve impulses. Transmission is by the bloodstream, whereas in the nervous system it's by neurons. Hormonal system has a relatively slow transmission, whereas the nervous system is very fast. Hormones travel to all parts of the body, but only target organs respond. Nerve impulses travel to specific parts of the body, so in many ways they're very similar. The response is very widespread in hormonal systems, whereas in nervous system it's very localized. The response is very slow in the hormonal system, and it's very rapid in the nervous system. And the response is very often long-lasting in the hormonal system, whereas it's much shorter-lived in the nervous system. So this is probably a little bit of revision really from what you would have done at GCSE. And so lastly, as we just bring this to an end, using an example, explain the function of an endocrine gland. And secondly, describe the pathway triggered by a stimulus in hormonal communication. So obviously I'd like you to pause at this point and see if you can answer those questions and think about some of the mark points that you might put in there. But I'm just going to go on and give you the answers at this stage. So firstly, to produce and secrete hormones is the function of the endocrine gland, and any named gland. So you could have used something like the adrenal glands and adrenaline, or you could have used the pituitary gland and ADH. Doesn't really matter which one you pick. And the second question, describing the pathway. A stimulus is detected, the gland is stimulated, the hormone is secreted, it travels in the blood and in the blood plasma, and it gets to the target cell, binds to the receptor, which triggers a response. And there's your 2 marks. Which brings me now to the very end of this presentation. I hope you found it useful, and you can obviously look at your textbook if you need to get any more information, or go back through the PowerPoint again. Thank you very much, everybody.